Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jesus Gomez-Velez. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Vanderbilt University. As a quick reminder, this lecture is being recorded, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions, and please do it through the Zoom Q&A functionality. What I'll do is I'll collect those questions and ask them on your behalf. Finally, following this lecture, I just want to remind you that we will be hosting a Gather virtual mixer. It'll be a lot of fun. It'll give an opportunity for our people to interact with each other and talk a little bit about all the interesting science that has been presented during the biennial. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this year's speaker for the Eagleson Lecture, Professor Heidi Nepf from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The Eagleson Lecture is named after Peter S. Eagleson, a scientist who integrated ecology and hydrology and redefined hydrology from the ad hoc engineering specialty to a multidisciplinary global environmental geoscience, in which the green living futures of ecosystems have an important part to play. He sought to develop new models of dynamic hydrology, looking at the hydrological cycle as the key process linking the physics, biology, and chemistry of their systems. Professor Nepf's contributions to our community embody the spirit of the Eagleson Lecture. And she is well known for her work on the impact of vegetation on currents, waves, and sediment transport in channels, wetlands, and coastal zones. Her lab focuses on the development of models for the physical processes that determine how vegetation habitats, for example, green infrastructure, provide coastal protection, impact landscape stability, improve water quality, and enhance blue carbon reservoirs. Professor Nepf is an outstanding educator, a prolific scientist with extensive contributions to the peer-reviewed literature, and a long list of awards and recognitions. Just to name a few, she's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, a Margaret McVicker Fellow, and the recipient of the Hunter Rose Hydraulic Engineering Award from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Today, we're here for a treat. Professor Nepf is going to tell us about the role of vegetation on currents, waves, and sediment transport. So welcome, Professor Nepf, and thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Can you hear me okay? The sound is okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm really happy to be here today, and I really thank Dr. Gomez-Velez for the invitation. And it's an honor to speak at the Pete Eagleson Lecture. He was one of the first people I met when I arrived at MIT many, many years ago. And his research has had a great impact on the study of terrestrial vegetation and ecohydrology. I will try to honor him today by discussing the role of aquatic vegetation in modifying waves and current and the feedback to sediment transport. So before I begin, I will just give a little context and motivation. Coastal vegetated landscapes such as salt marsh and seagrass and mangroves diminish the impact of coastal storms and waves. And when given the right conditions, they can grow along with sea level rise. For example, Narayan estimated that coastal marshes reduced flood damage during Hurricane Sandy by over $600 million. These systems also provide additional benefits, such as protecting coastal water quality and providing important habitat. In 2015, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget directed federal agencies to incorporate the restoration and management of vegetated landscapes, which they referred to as green infrastructure, in coastal planning. However, these efforts are stymied by a lack of modeling tools to quantify the functions of green infrastructure. For example, although the damping of waves by vegetation has long been noted, estimates of wave reduction are still empirical. Today, I'll discuss models for wave damping and use them to quantify the feedback between vegetation and bed stability. Although not as well known as their terrestrial counterparts, coastal vegetation provides more intense carbon sequestration. This table compares grams of carbon sequestered per square meter per year. The highest rates occur from marsh and mangroves and seagrass meadows, in part because their annual growth rate is more rapid. but also because aquatic ecosystems collect carbon beyond their own biomass. So aquatic vegetation, because it damps waves and damps currents and creates conditions that are conducive to settling, trapping material that is in suspension, they collect carbon that is entering from outside the ecosystem called allochthonous carbon. So often more than 50%, and in seagrasses as high as 70% of the carbon in these ecosystems is allochthonous. It's coming from outside the ecosystem. And that fraction is highly dependent on the hydrodynamic conditions for the delivery of the material and the retention of the material. And I know a lot of you are actually freshwater people, so I looked up the accretion rates for freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV, also very high. And freshwater marshes also high. So similar things I'm going to talk about today are definitely relevant for freshwater lake systems and freshwater marsh systems. So the blue carbon initiatives have recently received a boost from Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, who introduced a bipartisan blue carbon for our planet bill, which would create a national inventory of blue carbon ecosystems, would study the rates of carbon sequestration, and also initiate restoration of degraded ecosystems. The bill in part recognizes that we've lost many of these systems already, and we continue to lose them at 1 to 2% per year. So a better understanding of these ecosystems would lead to better management, protection, and restoration. So finally, I want to mention the Blue Carbon Initiative, which promotes the mitigation of climate through the conservation and restoration of coastal ecosystems. In the Paris Climate Agreement, countries declared how they would lower carbon emissions, and many countries included the promise to safeguard carbon stocks and enhance sequestration through conservation and restoration. So again, in order to verify this carbon, we need to understand some of the physical processes that influence carbon accretion, and that is certainly my focus, is the physical processes. So for example, vegetation is good at retaining sediment and carbon in part because it damps waves, which reduces resuspension and promotes sediment retention. So that's what the first half of my talk will be about waves. So let's start by considering the interaction of a single seagrass blade with a wave. And then I will build up understanding of how meadows of aquatic grass damp waves and impact resuspension. So this is actually a model blade, truth in advertising. It's attached to a small metal post at the bottom, which is connected to a force transducer so that we can directly measure the drag on the blade. And because the blade is flexible, it is moving in response to the wave, and we call this reconfiguration. Reconfiguration can reduce drag relative to a rigid blade of the same shape because the motion reduces the relative velocity and also makes the blade more streamlined. So I think you can recognize when it's bent over that it is achieving a more streamlined shape than a perfectly vertical blade. And you can see the fluid velocity reflected in these neutrally buoyant particles. If you look at the tip of the blade is moving very close to passively with the water. So when that part of the blade actually is not generating a lot of drag and therefore won't contribute a lot to wave dissipation because it's moving passively. But if you look near the boundary, down where the blade has less motion, you can see in every wave cycle, if you look closely, you can see eddies shedding. You can see small, violent rotational motion being arising in the fluid, and that is due to turbulence being shed from the stem. So later in the talk, I'm going to pull that back in, the importance of turbulence generated by the vegetation. But to start out, I just want to focus on the fact that most of this blade is moving passively and therefore not generating drag. And how am I going to account for that when I try to predict wave damping by seagrass? So reconfiguration in current has been, the effective reconfiguration on drag has been described by an effective blade length. So the effective blade length is the length of a rigid blade that provides the same drag as a reconfigured flexible blade. So to understand what I mean by that, let's first consider the blue blade, which is the rigid blade. It is perfectly vertical and does not move when I apply current. So the drag on that blade will have a quadratic drag law proportional to the fluid density, the drag coefficient, the width of the blade, and the length of the blade, L, and the velocity squared. Now, because the black blade is flexible, it can bend in the flow, and that both reduces its frontal area, but also makes it more streamlined. And both of those effects together make the drag less than its rigid counterpart. So we can write that force on the flexible blade using a quadratic drag law, but accounting for the fact that the effective length LE is less than the full length L. So in our lab, we've done a lot of work to understand through scale analysis and through experiment, how do we predict the effective length? Because if I can predict that, I can predict the force and I can predict the wave damping. So the ratio of, for currents, the ratio of the effective length to the true length, which again is just the ratio of the force on the flexible plant normalized by the force on a completely rigid plant, is proportional to a non-dimensional parameter called the CUAHSI number, which is the ratio of hydrodynamic drag to blade stiffness. When I want to extend the effective blade length to waves, I have to add an additional length scale, which relates the size of the plants to the scale of the wave motion. So a few notes about wave motion. When the crest is passing, the fluid is moving forward under the crest, but when the trough comes by, the fluid is moving backwards. So that as the crest trough is passing over a specific position at the bed, the fluid motion is creating these orbital motions. And the length scale of that orbit, which is the wave orbital radius or the wave excursion, is capital AW. And capital AW directly scales with the amplitude of the wave. So we need that length scale because it's saying how far does the fluid move with each passing wave. So now I can create two non-dimensional parameters that will describe how a seagrass blade reconfigures as a wave is passing. So the first is the wave CUAHSI number. Again, is the ratio of hydrodynamic drag to blade stiffness. If the CUAHSI number is less than 1, that means there's not enough hydrodynamic drag to bend the plant, and the plant remains perfectly vertical. So this might be often the case with sedges. They're pretty stiff, and even small waves won't tend to really bend them very much. So they have a small CUAHSI number. They could be treated as if they were rigid, vertical. But if the CUAHSI number is greater than 1, then the blades will begin to bend, as you saw in the video. And the way that they bend will be dictated by this ratio of blade length to wave excursion. So there's two classifications. If I have what are called long waves, so long waves will have a wave excursion that is much longer than the length of the blade, which means that as the crest comes by and the fluid is moving over this whole distance, the blade will bend and then be relatively stationary because it can't move anymore. It's basically reached the total extent of its total extent has been bent. So in this condition, there's lots of relative motion between the blade and the water because the blades actually are constrained by their length and how much they can move. But if we look at the short wave limit, which is actually more relevant in freshwater systems and systems with short fetch, if I have locally generated wind waves, then I have the scenario where the wave excursion is small compared to my blade length, which means that parts of the blade can move continuously with the blade. It's never constricted by its own size. And that's the case we're going to focus on today. So the way that a blade moves in a wave will depend on both of these parameters. And in fact, you can show through scale analysis depends on the product of these two parameters. So let's look at different kinds of blade motion I might observe for different values of CUAHSI number times blade length ratio. So as CAL increases in this direction, more of the blade moves passively, which is going to decrease the force relative to a rigid blade. So when CAL is very small, the blade can barely move at all. These blue horizontal lines are showing you the wave orbital diameter, so the full excursion that the water will make as the wave passes. So here, number one, there's lots of relative motion between the water and the blade. As the waves are getting a little stronger, then the blade or the blades are getting more flexible, the blade moves more. In 2 and 3, I see a cantilever-like movement, and you see the tip of the blade is moving over the entire wave orbital. So the tip of the blade is moving passively. Now I go to 4 and 5, and what you see now is that there's a region in the upper part of the blade that is not bending very much and is moving passively with the wave, and only below, say, this distance, if you can see my pointer, I hope so, the blade is exhibiting significant bending. And then if I even higher waves, then there's even smaller part of the blade that is exhibiting bending and more of the blade that is moving passively. So if I consider this dynamic condition, I can do some scale analysis that predicts that the force on the flexible blade relative to the force on the rigid blade will scale with Cauchy number times blade length ratio to the power -1/4. So as I noted earlier, we use a force transducer to actually measure the force on the blades. So I can measure the force on a flexible blade and compare it to the force on a rigid blade, which again, that ratio is the same as the ratio of the effective length over the full blade length. So I want to maintain the concept of the effective length, because that's how I'm going to use that later to do the wave dissipation. But right now, you can even just think of this as the ratio of the force on the flexible blade versus the force on the rigid blade. As the wave amplitude increases left to right, the force on the flexible blade is getting less and less compared to the force on the rigid blade, which means I'm going to get less wave dissipation. This range that I considered is consistent with what you would see in real marine seagrasses and also freshwater Vallisneria or freshwater aquatic grasses. And when you fit this line, you do see that the scale analysis was correct, that it's varying with the CAL to the power -1/4. So that's very powerful. And we're going to see if we can now use that to predict wave decay over a meadow. So if I make the assumption that my forces measured for one blade are representative of what a blade in a meadow would feel, then I can just basically multiply by the number of blades I have to predict the force on the whole meadow. And that will let me predict wave dissipation. We considered a simple model in the lab, which is representative of Vallisneria americana, which is a freshwater species, and Zostra marina, which is the marine species. They both have rhizomes beneath the surface, which you can't see, that come up in a sheath, bundles together many flexible blades that then come out of the relatively rigid sheath near the bed. So here's the sheath here, and then 3 flexible blades coming out. Here's a sheath and 4 flexible blades coming out. So we mimic that by having also a rigid sheath that bundled together. We have 6 flexible blades. All right, I didn't want to have a lot of equations, so really just listen to my words, and if you're familiar with waves, you probably know these equations. Long ago, Dalrymple et al. Predicted wave decay over a rigid meadow. So they said the blades are completely rigid and cannot bend. And if that is the case, then I can predict the rate of work done against canopy drag. So the rate of work done against canopy drag. So you should recognize in here, rho CD A U squared, that's the force on the blades, times U would be the work. A is my parameter, plant frontal area per canopy volume. So that's what's letting me convert from a single blade, which just has frontal area, to how much frontal area do I have per canopy. So it would be equal to the number of blades I have per bed area times the width of those blades times the length of the blades. The rate of work against canopy drag, if that's the only loss of energy from the system, then the wave energy decay can be predicted from that rate of work against the canopy drag. And if I assume a linear wave theory, then the velocity u that appears here is a function of the wave amplitude and a function of also water depth h and wave number or wavelength. And I can solve that to find an expression for how wave amplitude decays over a meadow, where AW0 is the wave amplitude at the start of the meadow, and I can predict how the waves will decay over the meadow. It has this form where KD is called the wave decay coefficient. It's a function of A, the frontal area per canopy volume, and the wave number that relates to the wavelength, the canopy height L, and the water depth H. And just to get you oriented, so if I measured over distance over this meadow here, the amplitude would decay faster if KD was large versus KD small. So I'm trying to understand how to predict KD so that I can predict the wave decay. Now, over a flexible meadow, I'm going to make the argument that I've just introduced to you the idea of the effective blade length. So it is the equivalent rigid length that gives the same drag as a flexible blade of the same length. So I can replace in this equation where L was the rigid length, that was the definition, I'm going to replace it with the effective rigid height of the meadow, LE. One final twist is that I previously showed you data just about the flexible segment, but now I also have to account for the sheath. So again, each model has a rigid sheath, and each rigid sheath has then flexible blades. So only the blades are moving and reconfiguring. So first I find the effective length of the flexible part of the blades, and then I just add on the sheath, which is rigid, so it's not gonna bend. And here's a picture of the meadow under some waves. And we tried many different meadow densities from 280 to 1800 plants per meter squared. And we measured the amplitude along the meadow. And from the measured amplitude, we backed out the decay coefficient KD. And now I want to talk about the measurements in red. And the black is what we'll call the rigid model. It's the original Dalrymple model, not corrected for the flexibility of the plants. And I've just repeated the expression for the direct decay coefficient, but I isolated some data where it's the same water depth and the same wave period and the same wave amplitude. The same frontal area per canopy, so same meadow density, and I'm only varying the wave amplitude because I think that's very instructive. If I do that, everything in black is a constant, and KD will vary only with drag coefficient and effective length. So, and I can also make the rightmost simplification because KL is very small, so hyperbolic sign becomes just L. So we see that KD is linearly proportional to the drag coefficient and the effective length. So I wanted to pull that out because I wanted to show you that the measurements are consistent with the scaling theory, even in the meadow. If we look, so first we'll look at the rigid meadow. So if I use the Dalrymple model to predict KD, then I am an order of magnitude higher than the measured KD. So it's clearly showing that I must account for reconfiguration if I want to make a correct prediction. If I use the, if I now look at the measured data, there's two attributes that cause KD to be a function of wave amplitude. One is that the drag coefficient, is declining. So the drag coefficient is a function of the Coulomb-Carpenter number, which is a function of wave velocity. So that makes CD a function of wave amplitude to the -1/3. So you see that dependence reflected in the rigid model. But the flexible model must also have the reconfiguration scaling. So this is the scaling that adjusts the drag to account for the reconfiguration. And that scales as amplitude to the -1/4. So when I put those together, CD times LE, I expect KD to be proportional to wave amplitude to the -0.58. And I observe it is proportional to the -0.63. So that's, I should have put the error bars on there. I'm very sorry. It agrees within uncertainty. So that's a nice confirmation that the model is doing a good job predicting wave dissipation and accounting for the fact that the wave decay is a function of the amplitude. And this is just to show that over many, many different conditions, we get the same result. So I don't want to, I'm going to move on. I'm looking at my time. I see that I might be slightly behind. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to consider how this it can be used to predict resuspension. So how am I going to combine wave damping to make predictions about sediment retention? So the first thing we have to do is realize that there's two mechanisms by which vegetation can influence sediment retention. The first is at the meadow scale. As waves propagate over the meadow, they're being damped due to the interaction with the meadow. That was what we just talked about. And we can now predict that. We can predict how fast does wave amplitude decay over a meadow. The second interaction is at the plant scale. So I need to introduce the idea that plants generate turbulence. Actually, we saw that at the beginning of the talk when we were looking at the video. And I hope some of you were able to see the eddies being shed from the plant. So when the wave motion goes back and forth past this plant, especially down here at the sheath, I'm shedding turbulence, and the turbulence is going to generate resuspension, or it's going to contribute to resuspension. It's going to augment resuspension. So turbulence generated by the plant can enhance resuspension. So I pulled some data from a recent paper by Tinoco and Coco, who looked at an array of rigid cylinders, but which is representative of maybe the sheath near the bed, because that is also rigid and roughly cylindrical. And what they observed was they were measuring the critical wave velocity that triggered resuspension. And starting from 0, having no cylinders, no plants, the critical value was highest. And as plants were added, the critical velocity for resuspension was going down. So as the solid volume fraction increased, the solid volume fraction of the array density increased, the critical velocity went down. And we now know we can attribute that to the generation of turbulence by the plant, and by assuming that the resuspension is triggered by a critical turbulence level. So let's see what I mean by that exactly. So can we predict the critical velocity based on the near bed turbulent kinetic energy? So historically, the resuspension is predicted by the bed shear stress. But in bare beds, the bed shear stress, tau C, and the turbulence are actually linearly related, because the bed shear stress is part of the production, right, of the turbulence. When I add vegetation, now I have a new source of turbulence. So the turbulent kinetic energy can be predicted if I can predict the vegetation generated turbulence, which we now can do. It's a function of the solid volume fraction, the velocity, and the drag coefficient. And the bed generated turbulence, which again, as I mentioned, is a function of just a drag, basically like a bed drag coefficient times wave velocity. If I use this prediction of near bed turbulence and I say that I can define, so that's number one, I can predict the turbulence within the seagrass meadow. Number two is I'm going to argue that it's the turbulence level that dictates resuspension, which means that I can define the critical level for turbulence based on previous studies that looked at the critical value of bed shear stress, because they're linearly related, and I can recast it in this form. So for the bare bed, I can go back into the literature and I can say, what's the critical level for turbulence for resuspension? I can base it on a critical wave velocity over bare bed. So subscript 0 is representing bare bed. I'm not sure why I picked 0. So if I say that this is the definition of the critical turbulence for resuspension, and I equate that to the top equation, I can solve for what is the critical wave velocity for resuspension in a meadow divided by the critical velocity for resuspension over a bare bed. I can get these values from the literature. And it is this function, which is predominantly just a function of the solid volume fraction, or how dense is my array. So this is saying that as my array becomes more dense, as I have more biomass, then the critical velocity for resuspension is being decreased relative to the bare bed. And the prediction does agree very well with the measurement. Okay, now I can combine those two ideas. The idea that the meadow will cause the waves to decrease as they propagate over the meadow, and the idea that the waves can provoke resuspension. And I'm going to use that to predict what is the meadow size that I need to suppress resuspension. Because remember, we want to bring this all back around to say, when does vegetation promote retention of sediment? Both because of its blue carbon relevance and also because it's very relevant to restoration efforts. So what I'm going, I took out the equation. So let me just talk you through it. If I know the grain size of my system, I can find what is the bare bed critical velocity. Lots of studies can give me that. I now know how to correct that for what is the critical velocity in the meadow based on the meadow density. So then I can get the critical wave velocity in the meadow. Then I can say, because wave amplitude is linearly related to wave velocity, I could say, what is the critical wave amplitude I need? And then I can say, if I know the amplitude starting the meadow at the beginning of the meadow, how big must the meadow be in order to reduce the amplitude down to this required critical value? And that's what this graph is shown to the left, to the right, sorry. So there's a lot going on here. So let's step through it. First of all, the different colored curves are representing different sediment sizes. So it's not surprising that the smaller the sediment size, so here's 10 micron, it's much easier to resuspend, meaning that smaller amounts of turbulence can resuspend it, which means smaller waves can resuspend it, which means I have to damp the wave much more before I can retain that sediment, which means the meadow needs to be longer to retain that sediment compared to a 100 micron particle. So I'll also mention that the solid line, just as a reference point, the solid line uses the bare bed, the dashed line is without stem turbulence. So the dashed line just used the bare bed critical velocity. And the solid line accounts for stem generated turbulence, uses the meadow critical velocity. So there is, maybe there is a 30% increase, a 30% shift. So the stem turbulence is important, but maybe not as important as the overall damping by the meadow. It's probably the dominant mechanism. And what might this mean? So what does it mean to say that my critical meadow size is 30 meters? So off the bat, it means that if I go 30 meters into the meadow before I will begin to retain those sediments. So if I was monitoring this meadow for carbon accretion, I would expect to see a difference within 30 meters of the edge of the meadow, because there I still have lots of resuspension, whereas in the interior of the meadow, I have shut resuspension off. So there's going to be heterogeneity in the retention of sediment and the heterogeneity in the accretion of allochthonous carbon. Another way we can use this is to think about restoration. So Van Katwijk did a meta-analysis of nearly 2,000 seagrass restoration projects, and she found that there was a very important correlation with the size of the restoration. So this is on the x-axis, the initial number of shoots, and the vertical axis is the log of the mean growth rate per months. And there's a critical number of initial shoots that if you're smaller than that, then the restorations tend to fail. That is, they tend to basically erode away. So for purposes of restoration, I know I have to be bigger than a certain size in order to be successful. And we can now connect that to resuspension. Wave-driven resuspension and erosion is often a limiting factor in seagrass restoration success. So if I use my model for 100 micron size, which is typical of coastal regions, and I get the blue line, I can say, well, I would like to do a restoration where I will plant 100 shoots per meter squared. So based from the size of the meadow needed would be 10 meters. So that means if I'm going to plant 100 shoots per meter squared, my meadow has to be at least 10 meters by 10 meters to make the waves damped enough that I don't have resuspension. So it's 100 shoots times 10 meters times 10 meters, 10 to the fourth shoots. If you go to 10 to the fourth shoots, you see that is indeed that critical switch. I have to be bigger than 10 meters. I have to be bigger than that in order for the meadow to provide the feedback of damping the waves that it can retain sediment and it can be self-sustaining. So again, this is just an example of how you can use this idea of the critical metal length to think about restoration strategies. Okay, in the last part of my talk, I'm going to switch over to think about current and how current plays a role and how it's modified by vegetation and how we can use that to inform coastal restoration. And I'm going to use the Louisiana coastline as my motivating example. Professor Gasparini also discussed this very important ecosystem yesterday. So I'm just going to re-emphasize how important the marshes of Louisiana are. Observations and models indicate that every mile of marsh reduces storm surge by 1/3 foot. And that is why the coastal wetland is known as the first line of defense against storms. And what you're seeing here is the map from 1932, before significant human intervention, when the Mississippi regularly flooded the marshes, supplying sediment to build the marsh and fresh water to maintain the vegetation. So it's a fresh water marsh. And this cycle was disturbed by development. So that since 1932, we've been losing 24 square miles per year. And in summary, the red regions are the regions that have been lost. The number one culprit was the levees built along the Mississippi River, again, which prevented the flooding so that the marsh was being starved of fresh water and sediment. Both of them are very important to maintain the marsh. So with the levees in place, the sediment was just being shunted way out into the ocean and couldn't benefit the marsh at all. So Mississippi has recently launched a very ambitious effort to try to rebuild the marshes with sediment diversions. And they've planned now 2 very large, I think each of them upwards of $2 billion, to build diversions where you will, in a very controlled fashion, pull water from the Mississippi over the levee and then into the marshes. One is in the mid-Barataria and the other is in mid-Breton. And it is very well established that the marshes need fresh water and they need sediment. So we were very optimistic that this is going to be a success. However, there's still some information that's needed, which is exactly what kind of a footprint to expect, or can we somehow promote better retention of the sediment by doing some planting ahead of time, some planting of vegetation. And the problem is that we don't completely understand the feedbacks between vegetation and sediment retention. So how do we grow a marsh? That is the question. So that was, to build a marsh requires 2 things: a supply of sediment to the marsh platform and the retention of that sediment on the marsh platform. So this is an aerial view of a section of the Mississippi River Delta, and the vegetation is in gray, and then mud flats are basically where there is not vegetation. And we're going to consider how vegetation influences both the supply and the retention. So first, let's consider the retention side. So this is a little bit redundant because I already convinced you, I hope, that turbulence, these little lovely orange eddies being shed by the plants, will lower the critical velocity for resuspension. So this is just another example of that. This is a graph showing the critical velocity for resuspension in vegetation, normalized by the critical velocity for resuspension under bare bed, and it decreases as the solid volume fraction of the vegetation increases. And I really want to highlight here that the data that was taken from widows used a natural bed with Spartina anglica, which is a real marsh plant. So this isn't just stuff that you see in the laboratory, it happens in real systems. So I won't do any more because we already talked a lot about that. So let's talk now about the other side, which is the supply side. So we're going to look at how sediment accumulation will depend on both the supply side and the percent deposition. So let's look first at what's in blue. The velocity onto the marsh platform will dictate how much sediment can be supplied, because obviously the supply is the concentration times the velocity. That's the flux onto the marsh platform. This graph is showing how the velocity on the marsh platform will vary with the plants per bed area. So the velocity is described by a momentum balance. G is gravity, H is water depth, S is the water slope, the energy gradient, CF is the bed drag coefficient, and this 1/2 CDAH, that's the drag of the vegetation. So CD is like a drag coefficient for the plant, and A, again, is the frontal area per canopy volume that we talked about before. This is for emergent vegetation. So I think it's very intuitive that as I have more plants on the marsh platform, there's more drag, the velocity will go down. So the supply is going to go down as I have more plants. Now, the velocity going down is a good thing because as the velocity goes down, I'm better able to retain the sediment because the turbulence level, which is controlling the critical velocity for resuspension, is going down as the velocity goes down. So the second graph we're going to look at is the percent deposition. So deposition, if I completely ignore resuspension, is just the settling velocity WS, this is in black down at the bottom, times the concentration. And the red is the modifier that accounts for resuspension, where UC is the critical velocity for resuspension, and U is the actual velocity given in blue. So when the actual velocity is above the critical velocity for resuspension, then you start to have no deposition. So that's the black line. And then when the velocity is below the critical velocity for resuspension, then I begin to moderate how much deposition can occur because some particles are being resuspended. And the accretion rate, the accumulation rate, is then going to be a product of these two things, and it creates a nonlinear dependence with vegetation density. So initially, as I begin to add plants, I'm going to go from left to right on this graph. I add some plants, the velocity go down a little bit, but doesn't go down enough to allow deposition to dominate, so I get no accretion. Then finally, the velocity goes down enough that I cross that threshold, the critical velocity, and accretion can begin, and accretion then begins to accumulate. But then the velocity gets so small, my supply is limited, so the accumulation rate goes back down. So this cartoon example is suggesting that there is a peak accumulation rate, and it does not happen at the peak vegetation density, which is what we might expect, because we're always expecting that the presence of vegetation reduces turbulence and velocity is going to enhance accretion rate. And we actually did see this trend in the Mississippi Delta. So again, here is that, here's the Mississippi River again, and here is our field site, which is near Cubit's Gap. And at our field site, it is a mudflat that then grows vegetation over the course of the growing season. So we were able to observe how accretion rate varied with vegetation density. And there are 3 species of vegetation. The typha, which is emergent, and the elephant ear, which is emergent. And for both of these plants, the part of the plant that's submerged is mostly the culm. The culm is where all of these stems or leaves are joined together. So it is almost very similar to a cylinder, the submerged part. The alligator weed is a fully submerged. It remains submerged. It's kind of flexible and bendy all over. And even though I've pulled these out to kind of look straight underwater, they're all bendy. And the alligator weed, we discovered, was in fact the most important control on the sediment accretion. So I wanted to show 2 images to sort of illustrate the seasonal variation in the submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV. So the SAV began to appear in April. It was 10%. I don't have a picture for that. In June, the submerged, the alligator weed almost completely filling in all of this open water, 70% coverage. This was measured using a drone. And then in July, the submerged vegetation died off. And so the area coverage of vegetation was only 20%. And over the course of this growing season, every month or so, a couple of months, we would put out tiles, literally flooring tiles. So here's the tile is here, was placed on the bed and then left for a month. and then we would go and retrieve the tile. We would mark the tiles with little garden stakes so we could find them. And what I want to emphasize was this engineering design that the grad student Maricel came up with, because she wanted to lift the slide up without losing all the sediment. So she created, I believe she 3D printed it, this box that was just the right size and sharp edged at the bottom, so she could put that box down onto the tile and then lift up the tile and the box together so that none of the sediment would be lost. So the accretion, let's look at the brown graph first. The accretion rate is the average across 6 tiles on the marsh platform. And she put out tiles and retrieved them every couple of months. So for April, we had pretty high accretion. June, we had very low accretion, and July had the highest accretion rate. So it's actually the mirror image of the SAV. So in June, when the system was choked off with the alligator weed, that was the lowest accretion rate. So when I had the most vegetation, I had the lowest accretion rate. And it's also very clear if you plot accretion rate versus percent SAV, there's obviously a peak value. So again, this was an exciting observation because it goes against this conventional wisdom that vegetation is an asset to sediment accretion, because sometimes it's not. And this is the kind of information that would be useful in order to understand how we might either do some preliminary planting before the sediment diversions, or how to do the timing of the sediment diversions so that we actually are capturing all the sediment. So a sediment diversion in April might be very productive, but a sediment diversion in June might not be productive at all, because all the sediment is still going to mostly be shunted off into the ocean. So in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that vegetated aquatic landscapes provide many ecosystem services, and that better restoration and management can be achieved by understanding the physical mechanisms by which vegetation impacts waves, currents, and sediment transport. I'd like to end by thanking the many people who have participated in this work with me: Dr. Gary Lay, Yuan Su, Dr. Chris Esposito of the Water Institute, Dr. Melissa Bauschen of the Water Institute, and Maricel Beltran Burgos of the Water Institute, and Dr. Cao Hong Tong. And I'm ready for any questions. I will leave you with this thought: marsh, seagrass, and waves in miniature ice study to heal the planet. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nepf, for a fantastic talk. So we are open for questions. Remember, you can post your questions on the Q&A button here in Zoom, and I'll do my best just to read verbatim each of the questions that I get. So we have a first question from Drew Guzwa. Fascinating work, thank you. For wave dumping under the vegetated case, you showed that the ratio of horizontal wave excursion to blade length is an important ratio. How does the ratio of blade length to wave, to water depth affect the dumping or sediment retention? What happens when it approaches or exceeds H versus L, for the case of L, very small? That is when the emergent vegetation versus fully submerged vegetation.
Yes, so that's a very good question. So when the vegetation is submerged, then what we call that the depth of submergence also has a very big control on wave dissipation, which kind of makes sense because in the higher water depth, the wave energy is distributed over the greater depth, and it's only doing work against the vegetation under a fraction of the depth. So yes, as the water depth becomes greater, the vegetation becomes less effective in damping the waves. I think that was the question. But the idea of how reconfiguration is influencing it remains the same, because as long as you know the wave velocity, you can predict the degree of reconfiguration and predict its impact on the decay coefficient.
So while we wait for other questions, I do have a question for you. So you show all this fascinating work both at the lab and in the field at the plot scale, and you learn a lot about the mechanics, the mechanisms that control these processes, deposition and resuspension, and so forth. How do you upscale this to represent it in mathematical models that try to do predictions at a much larger scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a toy model that we use that's a random displacement model, but it's definitely not. So in order to try to begin to couple together the idea of modeling how does the waves damping and how does it affect resuspension. But I think you mean more on like a coastal scale representation. I think that there you would never represent individual vegetation, but you could certainly predict the wave damping coefficient, right? You could say, how is wave energy being lost over this region of vegetation, sort of like as a sub-grid scale model. And at the same time, you could also, the characterization of the change in critical wave velocity, that can be done outside the model. So I think the limiting, so as it now stands, or if you wanted, we also have a characterization way of predicting turbulence. So if your coastal scale model is going to predict the evolution of waves, let's say over a vegetated lagoon, we can now give you the subgrid scale models to predict the turbulence within the vegetation. And then whatever you want to do with the turbulence, if you want to use that to predict sediment transport, then you can. I would say the limiting thing right now of upscaling is the heterogeneity of the vegetation and the ability to map it. So I think there's lots of very important questions that say, if I have a drone or I have a satellite image and I can tell you, here's the vegetation distribution and here's how heterogeneous it is. How much heterogeneity do you have to include in your numerical simulation to capture the right behavior? So I think that's a very important question. So I can't really answer that because in the lab, I don't have enough scale to look at the scales that are important in heterogeneity. But I guess the most interesting example would be like channeling, right? So I'm talking about how in our study in the Mississippi Delta and in the simulation we're doing, we're assuming that the flow goes onto the marsh platform almost in a 1D way through uniform vegetation. But imagine there was a channel. How big of a channel do you need before that assumption is no longer valid? So how big of a channel creates enough difference in transport between a vegetated region and a channel that you would have to reflect that in your simulation? I think there's lots of interesting questions there that are what's limiting our ability to take what I do at the lab scale and then put it into a coastal scale model. Because if the vegetation is heterogeneous at the grid scale, then how do I reflect that in the model? Right? Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Again, we don't have additional questions just yet. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel. I do have one more question since we're waiting. I'm curious, right? So you show all this work from the perspective of sediments, but have you looked at what happens with other contaminants of interest? Like microplastics or other pathogens, things like that.
That is a great question. There is a group at Boston University starting to look at microplastic capture in seagrass. I think that is I think microplastics to some extent would behave similarly to fine sediment. I think an avenue that they're observing is that microplastics are often captured in the biofilm. So that's something I didn't talk about at all. So there you go. There's another limitation of working in the lab. We don't generate realistic biofilms. A lot of seagrass has epiphytes, but like some kind of filamentous epiphyte that can trap a lot of microplastics. So that's what they're observing. And that's probably also true of trapping other things from the water column. So I think that's another element of real systems that needs exploration. But I definitely think everything that I'm describing about sediment could also be translated into microplastics. All you would need to know really is the sediment size, the settling velocity, which I'm not sure has been characterized for a lot of microplastics, but that would be the physical link in order to put it into the models.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nepf. I think, oh, actually, we do have one more question. So from Andrew Wilcox.
Okay.
Are there examples of shifts in vegetation communities in coastal areas to species with different morphologies and thus different biogeomorphic feedbacks, analogous to species invasions along rivers? Or are such shifts anticipated with climate change or sea level rise?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I'll start by saying that in many coastal systems, you will already observe a zonation of the plants. So in systems that are wave dominated, you will have plants that grow near the edge of the marsh are actually more flexible because they're trying to reduce their drag. They're exposed to the highest waves, and so they're trying to reduce their drag so that they can survive. And then as you move inland, the vegetation is changing both within the species. It can change its biomechanical properties, but also then it has a shift to a different species that is more rigid and more emergent as the waves get weaker as you move inshore. I think with sea level rise, those plants will have to move, because as the sea level goes up, higher waves can penetrate farther into a marsh, so probably they will have to shift. With invasive species, I think, well, first of all, I think there's less variety of coastal vegetation. I mean, there's basically a handful of salt marsh plants, and then a handful of seagrasses, and then mangroves. So those are the main classifications. So amongst salt marsh plants, the main bad actor is actually Phragmites. So Phragmites is very invasive in the United States, but ironically, the best at wave damping. So when people are thinking, do we want to rebuild or manage a coastal marsh for the purpose of coastal protection, Phragmites is a great choice, but it's an invasive species. So I feel like that's definitely going to be a discussion that needs to occur. Okay, so maybe I kind of answered that, but thank you for that question.
Yeah. Well, I think our time is up for today, but thank you, Dr. Nepf, again. It was a fascinating talk, and thanks for accepting the invitation. I just want to remind everyone that we have a Gather virtual mixer after this, so please come and join us, and maybe we can ask more questions then. Thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.